When you're new, you have to have the framework to go out and test things out and to try and find yourself in a sales process, especially when you're coming up through the SDR role, which is very task driven. My sales philosophy is really focused on culture and team building. But really, if you boil it down, if I were to say that one thing I focus on the most is creating infrastructure, and once that infrastructure is in place, trying to empower my people. And and that could mean that they're leaning on me for various different things that it takes to help support them to get the mission accomplished. But part of that is because I hadn't had a lot of success in trying to get, big phenomenal gains out of coaching on its own. And I've had a lot more success with trying to find operational areas to put people in positions where they can win. So, you know, early on in my career, we had kind of a territory based approach. This is just an example of this. And we were really struggling to have some of our newer AEs on the team go out and win and find success. And I think what we determined was that in a territory-based approach, you get all shapes and sizes. But when you're new, you have to have the framework to go out and test things out and to try and find yourself in a sales process, especially when you're coming up through the SDR role, which is very task driven. And they had a lot of apprehension with some of the larger accounts, which it totally makes sense. And yet, their goals and their territory was comprised of these things, and it can be distracting and it can be really difficult to try and find your way in that environment. So, for example, my philosophy is, okay, if we could just make it so they can go practice and go try and complete that process of finding themselves, that would look like giving them a lot of really small micro accounts to start with. So they didn't really feel like they had the luxury to bruise fruit if they needed to kind of learn and test the waters, to do that. And, that's really been something that I've applied universally throughout. I apply it to my top performers as well.
That's a really good answer. So is that what you mean by infrastructure and the people?
Yeah. Infrastructure would be processes, policies. It would be the best way to frame it up. Anything that you can do to kind of draw a line around this box and you say, like, don't go here, but everything else in between and apply your own creativity, that's fine. That is kind of the methodology that I follow.
So there's like an area that your team, your reps will know that they can try, be creative and kind of take that risk because you've assessed that the deal isn't potentially the biggest deal in the pipeline right now.
Yeah, and that's just an example, right? But that goes really for everything. It goes for, the framework and how they go to market and try and, create conversations with prospects. It goes for emails. Think of all the tactical stuff, what happens in a meeting. And what we try and control are the big things that we don't want to risk, but not control everything. Right? We empower them to be creative and try and make decisions that will kind of help further the business from a tactical standpoint down the road and to find new things that we might not know as leaders.
Oh, okay, brilliant. So, well, tell me about the metrics. So what would you say the metrics you rely on as the core to the revenue function?
Sure. The biggest metric that you focus on in revenue would be the funnel, right? So everything that comes in. Now I'll name drop here. We use Winning by Design and Jocko Vanderkooj's model, which is kind of like you have two funnels. You have a funnel that comes through prospecting, and then you have a kind of a reverse looking funnel that comes through for the customer journey. But it's the entire thing, end to end. So the metrics that we focus on the prospecting side, which I'll probably use to answer this, are, leads. What is the definition of a lead? And then once they enter a sales cycle, We have various stages that we apply and we use to measure things, and definitions for those stages, and different pieces to support our people. And that's kind of like the main focus that we have. And then what ends up happening is that at any stage across the funnel, which is very strategic in nature, you start to ask these questions like, why isn't this working and why isn't that working? Like anything, different things break down as things evolve, and different challenges, face the business that might, impact our strategic priorities. So, you're really only going to get out of it what you have coming into it. And that kind of goes, because I do want to dovetail on this a little bit, that kind of goes to one of the biggest challenges that I notice, or one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of leaders make is how they make decisions based on, their metrics. And what I have found is that if you try and create metrics and then try and bring behaviors to those metrics, that's one of the biggest mistakes. So I'll give you an example of this, and kind of what this really means. If you create a metric that says like, hey, we really want to know if we're losing a competition, because our gut says we're losing to competition, right? And maybe this is one of the things that when you're trying to talk with product and other members of your revenue team, and you're trying to figure out how we can close the gap to hit our strategic goals, maybe that comes up. We go out and we say, okay, salespeople, go tell us about product. But you put that at the end of that question at the end of a sales cycle. So like before you lose the deal, or close wins the deal, tell us who the competition was. Well, the problem is that you really have to put yourself in the driver's seat of the rep and say, I'm a rep, I'm losing this deal, I have to give this information back to the revenue team as part of the feedback loop. Well, what's in it for that person at that time? And most of the time, the salespeople are thinking like, how do I move on to the next thing? So when we look at metrics and developing metrics, we're trying to find different ways that make it rewarding for the rep to put the information in and make it accurate. Because I think one of the biggest things that you can do are make decisions based on bad data.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think that because you are a sales leader, you understand what other reps are thinking, and that's why you have this like passion for data and being operationally efficient, but you're able to feed back in with your own experiences to help?
Yeah, some of that helps. But I think it also helps just to be candid with your people and ask them, okay, well, we want to gather this. How can we gather it? And sometimes they come back to you and they'll say something like, well, what's in it for me? And you do have to have the broader vision, but I do think it is a partnership with them to try and create better outcomes, and to kind of tie, what is the business trying to achieve when we want to know these sorts of things, and how does this impact them? And sometimes when it doesn't, you kind of come back and you say, well, how do we gather this passively? So, sometimes it's a partnership whenever you can, and other times it's how do we create things or the infrastructure that allows us to passively track this stuff without impacting them, so we can still get good data.
Fab. Okay, so Mark, talk me through your take on these metrics, or how do metrics bridge the gap between the tactical and strategic divide?
So from this perspective, at least this is how I view it. Metrics are almost always tactical. I don't think you can really bridge them for strategy. I pretty much use metrics as just a feedback loop for strategy. I think you can definitely overthink things when it comes to this. We talked a little bit about bad metrics earlier, so maybe I can dovetail on that a little bit, but really it's just for a feedback loop. So, as you have a strategy, you're trying to determine like, how do we make moves with these various different tactics? Well, if you don't measure tactics, and you're never able to change them, right? You have to know what works and what doesn't. So, to kind of come back with bad metrics and decision making, I'll give you kind of an example of like how I visualize this working, and what my take is and how to bridge it. So like, let's say I'll give you another example. You know that in the funnel, and let's come back to the funnel, you know that in the funnel, we have to have X amount of leads. And there is a certain formula that a leader told me once: activity times competency equals results. And the credit goes to Dave O'Brien for that one. You know, that's great. And I think that's a really simple, great formula to follow. But what is competency? And if we just look at, okay, well, we can make calls and get X amount of leads, but we're really not examining what's happening in those calls, then we could come out and say, tactically, we need to increase calls tenfold. And really, it's not going to drive the needle anymore. Then, and maybe sometimes the best solution is make less calls and have higher quality. So, you know, what we do, for example, is we look at connections, but we don't give them the opportunity to say, is it a connection? We have them say, hey, I talked to a decision maker, which logs notes. Hey, I didn't. It doesn't log notes that same way. So we make it rewarding for them that when they do that, they see good information. And that's an example of passive. But what we're able to do from there is start to coach back to those tactical maneuvers and make adjustments. So when we come back and we say this tactical maneuver did or didn't work, you know, here's the data that's feeding that. So we can have better tactics that support the global strategy. But I think that's probably the best way for me to answer that one. I think, by the way, I think that's probably the toughest question that I could probably answer. I think that's tough, but so it's a really good one, but that's probably my take on it.
So it's quite interesting that you feel as if the tactics is a feedback loop, and there's not necessarily a gap that you can bridge between the strategic and the tactical. So, okay, that makes sense. Is that why you talk about bad data as well? So if you have bad data, it's kind of telling you the wrong information about how effective these tactics are.
Yeah, I just see strategy could be something that is intangible, right? So like, you know, maybe part of the broader strategy is to increase your brand exposure. Then you can get lots of different tactical pieces of information that tells you is it good or not, you know, NPS, or you know, you can do a market survey to find out, you know, how do people perceive your brand or what your brand awareness is, or you can do interviews to kind of score 1 out of 5 or what have you. But the reality is that, you know, the strategy itself, if you just focus on the metrics of the operations, it's just really affecting the tactic at that time of what is the score, or what, you know, what is how many customers know about us, but that never really impacts the strategy itself. It just really still only impacts the tactics. I mean, you could come back and say, hey, maybe we might need to change brand strategy altogether. But often I find that most executive teams don't want to do that. The strategy is well defined already, or maybe that just has to do a little bit with my role of being a VP versus a CRO or something. But that's how I visualize it.
Okay, well, that's fine. We can interview you again if you ever become a CRO, and let's see if your answer changes.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely.
We'll do it.
Absolutely.
Okay, Mark, I want to ask you, so what would you say your challenges are being operationally efficient? And can you talk to me about a time that you've had to overcome it?
Operationally efficient, operationally focused. I think the way that I tend to think is pretty skeptical in nature. I like slow decisions. I love making decisions when I have a lot of data, but I think what ends up happening is that's not just how businesses run on day to day all the time, right? So there's tons of times where you don't have enough data, or you have some data, or you don't trust the data to make a decision. So I think, you know, my biggest challenge is just slower decision making. And one thing that's helped me is this concept of one-way or two-way doors, and Jeff Bezos talks about this a lot in what they do. And I always can make decisions fast when I have data at my fingertips and I can feel really confident. When I don't, what I tend to do is really try and picture it from that Jeff Bezos perspective, where in the case of one-way doors, which means, hey, if we make this decision, we can't walk back through it. I probably still will lean on my strength of, okay, how can we come up with a process to make sure that it's as sound as possible? And what has really helped me is the concept of two-way doors where, okay, well, let's take this decision, let's kind of throw it out and see what happens. And worst case scenario, we step back through that. And if you're ever kind of in this spot where I am, and you're ever kind of holding up the process, or you really want more data, I think looking at that two-way door and finding opportunities to make two-way doors can be something that you can really lean on. It's definitely worked for me to speed up the process. And I find that it's very rewarding when you can do that too.
Okay. So is it about thinking whether a situation is kind of, once you do that decision and you take that decision, it's set in your way? Is it about like finding an alternate route? So even if things go wrong, there's always kind of a backup plan there. That's your two-way door.
Yeah, I would say the two-way door, you kind of hit the nail on the head. The two-way door would be kind of the backup plan. You can go back through it. You can just reverse the change altogether. You can lean on a plan B. In some cases, you might not be able to lean on a plan B because plan B can be detrimental to the business. I mean, especially when it comes to selecting other leaders, right? And I think a lot of one-way doors is what can paralyze decision-making for companies. And the one-way doors is really what determines, is a company a risk taker, or are they more conservative too? Because, people selection, especially when they're leading other people, that's definitely can be a one-way door if you do it ineffectively. If you decide strategically to do something with your customer base that has negative results, that could have some repercussions that could damage brands. So like one-way doors typically are related to, I think, how you engage with other people. And if you've had a bad experience with somebody, you might be done depending on what it looks like. So that's probably the best way to frame it.
Oh my God, that's so interesting. It's so true. Impressions, they matter, and it just, no matter what goes wrong, it's just really great to have a good impression, because the world isn't as big as we think it is. So it's a really cool answer. Okay, Mark, what mistakes have you made that you could share with the community? I'm quite interested to hear your answer here.
Well, I mean, I started out thinking about what of all the things that I've done wrong, and it didn't take me long to make a list. I personally learn best from my mistakes. But I think the one thing as it pertains to just, trying to think about the business as a process or business as a scientific kind of approach is I often try and apply logical process to illogical problems. And that probably is the number one pitfall that I have, and I still constantly am working through it. And it ranges through everything, through communication, everything, all the way down to just how I perceive the world. But what I have found is, at the core of this, running businesses and interacting with customers and leading teams, it's really all about people at the end of the day. And no matter what you do, there's no substitute for quality time. It doesn't really matter how logical your argument is. Sometimes you just need to be there to listen to somebody talk about, their day or what has impacted them. And as long as, regardless of what the logical solution is, you're there to help. I find that that's the thing that kind of gets me through, is just, hey, maybe I have a logical solution, but really I just need to ask them what they need me to do to help them,
Mhm.
and just take a leap of faith and kind of go from that angle. That's what helps me. But I think that's probably the biggest mistake.
Mm.
Logical process to illogical problems, motion, stuff like that.
Mhm. Is it about thinking whether this person requires a logical response or whether they need something else more emotionally?
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to pretend to be an expert on this, and I'm more
Mhm.
because sometimes I still am like, okay, well, let's follow a process with
Yeah.
this. It doesn't mean that I don't try and think about how I can logically get better
Yeah.
at what you're talking
It's still
about.
doing it's still
Like, what's this?
logical.
But I am always thinking about the scientific process to it.
Mhm.
But I think just be in the moment, try and be in the moment as much
Mm.
as I can, and maybe try not to be logical and just listen
Mhm.
sometimes. Anybody that's gonna listen to this that knows me is gonna be like, yeah, like they're gonna know. I'm sure they'll have a ton of different mistakes for me. They're like, yeah, you do this and this and this all the time. So
I could
anyhow,
think of a few examples, yeah.
right,
Right, okay.
absolutely.
Okay, Mark, last question for you. If you was in a room full of revenue leaders, what's the one burning question that you would want an answer to?
Yeah, how do you inspire people? And I don't just mean about like the people they're leading, but really, if you want to know what I'm fascinated with, is like, how do you inspire team members that don't directly report to you,
Mhm,
to look at your initiatives and to get behind them, you know, and if there's a magical scientific process to it, I would love to know,
mhm,
right? Because that's how I'm wired. But I would say that that's probably the thing that I'm fascinated the most with right now, and until I figure that out, because I don't think I have the answers to that either. I'm still trying um, to find my way there.